Barron Trump had always been a mystery to the public. Unlike the other children of famous politicians, he was rarely seen, rarely heard, and almost never involved in scandals or controversies. But for those who knew him personally, his teachers, classmates, and a select few family friends, one thing was clear: he was unlike any other political heir before him. Tall, composed, and with a presence that made people stop and take notice, Barron carried himself with a quiet confidence that often caught people off guard. He wasn't flashy, he wasn't loud, and he wasn't interested in playing the part of a celebrity kid. But that didn't mean people didn't talk about him. And at one of the most prestigious private schools in the country, talking was all they did. The elite boarding school that Barron attended prided itself on being the home of the intellectual elite, a place where the sons and daughters of billionaires, CEOs, and political dynasties were shaped into future world leaders. But in a place like this, where power was measured by the wealth of your last name and the influence of your family, Barron Trump was both an enigma and a target. From the moment he stepped onto campus, people had opinions about him. "Oh, he's just another spoiled rich kid. I bet his dad bought his way in. I wonder if he even had to take the entrance exams." The whispers followed him through the halls, in the classrooms, on the soccer field. He was the tallest kid in the school, standing at an almost surreal 6'7", but that wasn't the only thing that made him stand out. It was the way he carried himself: quiet but firm, observant but not passive, polite but not submissive, and to some, that was a problem. Because if there was one thing certain students and even a few teachers at the school hated, it was the idea that a Trump could be more than what they assumed. And one day, a group of them decided to put that to the test. The setting was an advanced political science class, a course that was usually filled with the children of politicians, business moguls, and international elites. The professor, a well-known progressive academic who had made a career out of criticizing conservative politics, had seen Barron as nothing more than a symbol of everything he despised. And today, in front of the entire class, he was going to make an example out of him. He cleared his throat, setting his coffee down as he looked directly at Barron, who sat calmly near the back of the room. "Mr. Trump," he began, his voice carrying that smug authority that only seasoned academics could master, "I suppose you've spent your life believing that success is something inherited rather than earned." The room went still. Several students turned their heads, some smirked. Others, who had been secretly hoping for this moment, leaned forward in their seats. This was it. This was the moment someone finally called him out. But Barron didn't react. He simply looked at the professor, his expression unreadable, his towering frame relaxed but still commanding presence. The professor smiled, thinking he had won the first round. "Tell me, Mr. Trump," he continued, "do you believe you'd be sitting here if your last name wasn't Trump?" A few students snickered. The professor's grin widened, and then Barron spoke. His voice was calm, measured, and chillingly composed. "I don't know, Professor," he said, tilting his head slightly. "Do you believe you'd be standing there if your job didn't depend on keeping kids like me out?" The room erupted into stunned silence. The professor's smirk vanished instantly. And for the first time in his career, he had no comeback. Because what Barron had just done wasn't just a response, it was a checkmate. And this was only the beginning. The moment Barron Trump delivered his response, the entire classroom froze. It wasn't just the words he had chosen, though they were precise and piercing. It was the way he had said them: calm, level, and completely unshaken. There was no hint of anger, no desperation to prove himself, no childish retort, just a simple, undeniable truth. The professor, a man who had spent decades debating some of the most brilliant minds in academia, stood there, blinking rapidly, as if his brain was struggling to process what had just happened. He had expected resistance, sure. Maybe some stammering, maybe a defensive rant about how Barron had worked hard despite his privilege. Maybe even an awkward attempt at humor to defuse the moment. But he had not expected to be rendered completely speechless, and neither had the class. Some students sat in stunned silence, gripping their pens as if they had just witnessed something historic. A few exchanged quick glances, their faces a mix of disbelief and admiration. One student, a well-known critic of anything related to the Trump family, shifted uncomfortably in his seat, biting his lip, as if he had suddenly begun to reconsider everything he had assumed about the young man sitting in front of him. Barron, meanwhile, hadn't moved an inch. He simply stared back at the professor, his expression neutral but unyielding. The room belonged to him now, and everyone knew it. The professor, realizing that he had just lost control of the conversation, cleared his throat and forced a small, strained smile. "Well," he said, shifting uncomfortably, "that's certainly an interesting perspective, Mr. Trump." Barron said nothing, simply tilting his head slightly as if waiting to see what excuse the professor would manufacture next. "But surely," the professor continued, "you don't mean to suggest that privilege and opportunity don't play a role in success. After all, history has shown us that those born into wealth and power, people like yourself, have an undeniable advantage over others." A few students nodded hesitantly. It was the first lifeline the professor had thrown himself, an attempt to steer the conversation back onto familiar ground, to return to the comfortable narrative. But Barron wasn't going to let him take control so easily. He leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on the desk, his expression unreadable. And then, he did something no one expected. He started asking the questions. "Professor," Barron said, his voice smooth but firm, "how many students in this class come from wealthy families?" The professor blinked. "Excuse me." "You heard me," Barron replied. "This is one of the most exclusive schools in the country. The tuition alone is more than most people make in a year. So, tell me, how many students in this room come from families worth millions, billions?" No one spoke, because everyone in the room knew the answer. Almost every single student sitting in that classroom, including the ones who had laughed at the professor's initial jab, came from families just as privileged as Barron's. He let the silence stretch for just a second before continuing. "And how many of them have ever been asked the same question you just asked me?" The professor's smile faltered. "How many of them," Barron continued, gesturing toward his classmates, "have had to defend their own success? How many of them have had to prove that they belong here? How many of them have had their last names turned into an accusation?" A few students shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The ones who had previously smirked or whispered about him now stared at their desks, avoiding eye contact. Because Barron had just done what none of them had ever dared to do. He had turned the microscope back on them. And suddenly, they didn't like it. The professor was losing ground fast, and he knew it. He had spent years framing discussions around power and privilege, structuring debates in a way where certain people could never win. But now, standing in front of a student who wasn't following the script, he found himself in unfamiliar territory. "Privilege is not a crime, Professor," Barron continued, "but hypocrisy is. If you want to have an honest conversation about power, let's have one. But let's talk about all of it, not just the parts that fit your narrative." The air in the room was thick with tension, the kind of tension that comes before something irreversible happens, because this wasn't just an argument anymore. This was a shift in power. And the professor, for all his degrees and years of experience, had no idea how to regain it. For a moment, no one moved. The professor, who had built a reputation on his ability to control a room, now stood in complete silence, blinking as if trying to reset the entire situation. His years of experience in steering conversations, shaping narratives, and silencing opposition had just been appended by an 18-year-old. And not just any 18-year-old. Barron Trump. The entire power dynamic of the classroom had shifted in a way that no one, not even Barron himself, had fully anticipated. This was not how these types of interactions were supposed to go. When professors challenged privileged students, the students were supposed to shrink, apologize, backtrack, or at the very least, awkwardly laugh it off. But Barron had done none of that. Instead, he had done the unthinkable. He had pushed back. And in doing so, he had exposed a truth that many of the students in that room had never wanted to confront. Because they weren't angry that Barron was privileged. They were angry that he wasn't ashamed of it. The professor, still trying to recover, cleared his throat and forced a smirk back onto his face, as if regaining his composure. "Well, Mr. Trump," he said, his voice carrying an artificial lightness, "I must say, that's quite the deflection. You're clearly very skilled in debate." A few students chuckled nervously, sensing that their teacher was trying to regain control. "But let's not avoid the original question," the professor continued, leaning forward slightly, trying to reassert dominance. "Do you, or do you not, believe that your last name has given you an unfair advantage in life?" This was supposed to be his moment of recovery, his way of forcing Barron back onto the defensive. But Barron didn't hesitate for even a second. Of course, it has, he said simply, just like your last name helped you get here. The professor froze. This was not the answer he had expected. Not the guilt-ridden confession that many would have given. Not the weak denial that would have been easy to mock. Not the excuse-filled justification that he could have easily torn apart. Just a direct, unshaken truth. Advantage isn't the problem, Barron continued, his voice steady. The problem is when people pretend they don't have it. The professor leaned back slightly, his smirk faltering again. I could stand here and pretend that I haven't had more opportunities than most, Barron went on, but so could you. So could almost everyone in this room. This is one of the most expensive private schools in the world. Do you think any of us got here by accident? The students were silent again. Because the truth was, he was right. Every person in that classroom had been born into some level of advantage. Wealth, power, influence, connections. It was how elite schools like this worked. And yet, only one person in the room had ever been forced to explain themselves. Because only one person had the last name Trump, something shifted at that moment. Barron wasn't just winning the argument anymore, he was changing the entire conversation. A few students who had previously mocked him were now looking at the professor with uncertainty, as if suddenly realizing that the man they had admired might not be as infallible as they had believed. Others, the ones who had always been on the fence about Barron, started nodding slightly, their perspectives beginning to shift. Even the students who still disliked him looked uneasy, not because they had changed their opinions, but because they could feel the power dynamic slipping out of their control. For years, the rules had been clear. Students like Barron were meant to be the villains in these conversations. They were supposed to be called out, embarrassed, put in their place. But now, for the first time, someone had refused to play by those rules. And the system didn't know how to handle it. Before the professor could respond, there was a knock at the door. The classroom turned as one, watching as the head of the department stepped inside, her sharp gaze scanning the room before settling on the professor. "Professor, can I speak with you for a moment?" she asked, her voice measured but carrying an undeniable authority. The professor blinked, his jaw tightening. "We're in the middle of, now," she interrupted, her tone leaving no room for debate. The professor hesitated, glancing toward Barron one last time before reluctantly stepping out into the hallway. The moment the door closed behind him, the students erupted into whispers. Did they hear what happened? Is he in trouble? Dude, I've never seen anyone shut him down like that. Did Barron actually just win that argument? Barron, meanwhile, remained perfectly still. He didn't join in the whispering. He didn't gloat. He didn't even react. He simply sat there, calm and unreadable, as if he had already known this would happen, because he understood something that no one else in that room did yet. This wasn't over, it was just beginning. Because when the system can't win an argument, it finds other ways to fight back. And what happened next would prove that beyond any doubt. The hallway outside the classroom was eerily quiet. The professor stood stiffly in front of the department head, his face flushed with frustration, his hands balled into fists at his sides. He was not used to losing control, least of all in his own classroom, least of all to a Trump. "What exactly is going on in there?" the department head asked, her tone firm but neutral. "A disruption," the professor spat, clearly struggling to contain his anger. "A student who doesn't understand the nature of privilege, pushing dangerous rhetoric in my classroom." The department head raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. "I see," she said. "And this student? He simply disagreed with you?" The professor hesitated. "He challenged the discussion in a way that undermines the academic setting," he said finally, choosing his words carefully. The department head sighed, rubbing her temple. "You mean he made a point you couldn't refute?" The professor's jaw clenched, but he didn't respond, because they both knew the truth. Barron hadn't been disruptive. He hadn't been disrespectful. He hadn't even raised his voice. He had simply been right. And that was the real problem. Because in a school like this, in academic circles like this, the narrative was everything. The idea that people like Barron Trump were born into undeserved power, that they would never truly struggle, that they couldn't possibly understand the world beyond their privilege, that was the foundation upon which these institutions were built. And now, a single student had just exposed the cracks in that foundation. And the system could not allow that to stand. While the professor was outside, the students in the classroom wasted no time dissecting what had just happened. Some sat in stunned silence, replaying the argument over in their heads. Some whispered excitedly, as if realizing for the first time that someone had actually won against a professor known for never backing down, but others were already looking for a way to spin the narrative back into their favor. "He's just good at debating, that's all," one student muttered under her breath, trying to dismiss what had happened. "Yeah," another agreed quickly. "Just because he can argue well doesn't mean he's right." "It's still privilege," someone else whispered. "It's just privilege with better talking points," and just like that, the narrative was being rewritten. It didn't matter that Barron had made valid points. It didn't matter that the professor had been visibly shaken. It didn't matter that for the first time, someone had flipped the script on the system itself, because when the system loses, it doesn't admit defeat. It shifts the goalposts. It changes the conversation. It creates a new attack, and Barron Trump was about to learn that firsthand. By the time Barron left class that day, the wheels were already turning against him. A meeting had been quietly scheduled between the school administration and a select group of faculty members. Emails were being drafted, carefully worded statements about the school's commitment to fostering inclusive discussions. Students had already started posting online, shifting the story from "Professor gets humiliated" to "Trump's son disrupts class with dangerous rhetoric." And then, the final move came. An official notice was sent to Barron's inbox that evening. It was a mandatory meeting with the school's disciplinary board. The charge: creating a disruptive learning environment. The next morning, Barron walked into the administrative building alone. No lawyers, no PR advisors, no security. Just him. The room was small and cold, the kind of space designed to feel impersonal and intimidating. Across from him sat 3 faculty members: the head of the disciplinary board, the professor from the previous day, and a neutral observer who had clearly been chosen to give the illusion of fairness. The professor didn't look at him. The department head remained unreadable. And then, the meeting began. "Barron," the head of the board began, her tone calm but firm, "do you understand why you're here?" He didn't blink. "I assume it has something to do with me answering a question in class." The professor stiffened slightly, but still said nothing. "You created a disruption," the board member continued. "Several students expressed discomfort with the nature of the discussion, and we received complaints that your statements were," she hesitated, "problematic." Barron tilted his head slightly. "Problematic how?" The board member glanced at the professor. The professor remained silent, because there was no real answer. "We're not here to argue over details," she said instead. "We simply want to ensure that every student feels safe and heard in the classroom." "I see," Barron said. "And did you call in the students who made comments about me before I even spoke?" Silence. "Did you call in the students who laughed when I was singled out?" More silence. "Or," Barron continued, "is it only considered problematic when I respond?" The board member shifted uncomfortably. The professor finally spoke. "That's not the point, Mr. Trump." Barron turned his attention to him. "No, Professor," he said, his voice calm. "I think that's exactly the point." The professor opened his mouth to respond, but Barron was already standing up. "If this school's idea of fairness is punishing students for answering questions they were asked," he said, "then maybe the real problem isn't me." Then, without another word, he walked out. What happened next was not what the school expected. The attempt to silence Barron Trump had the opposite effect. Instead of fading away quietly, his story went viral. Students who had remained silent before began speaking up. Professors who had once felt powerless to challenge the system started questioning how free academic discussion truly was. And most surprisingly of all, some of Barron's biggest critics found themselves rethinking their stance, because the truth was clear now. This had never been about privilege. This had never been about fairness. This had always been about control, and the system had just lost it.